I'm Wesley Reed. I'm the manager of Business Continuity Services with GTCC, and also want to introduce, and really happy to have today, Ron Horn, who is our Chief Information Officer, and also Kristen Dotson, who is the Director of Institutional Support and Special Projects. This format may be a little different for you today, just to make you aware, because I'm going to begin, we're going to turn over and have like a question and answer in the middle. We are asking for any questions that you have along the way. If you put them in the chat for us, and we'll get to all of those at the very end. But the title here is kind of more of a playful term in terms of pandemic cyber attack and what else could go wrong. And we know in this particular industry, a lot else could go wrong. So it was just kind of one of those things where we just know how this industry is in general. I'm going to move forward just to tell you a little bit about GTCC and Greensboro and this area overall. We're considered the Piedmont Triad, and basically Guilford County is a little over 500,000 citizens. Greensboro is the largest city, and it has a little over 300,000. So that's pretty much 500,000 for the county, 300,000 is the biggest city, and we have a lot of other towns and cities around overall. Guilford College itself, Guilford Technical itself has more than 80 programs, as you can see, a variety of professional development and personal enrichment type of courses. We are the fourth largest of the 58 institutions here with the North Carolina Community College system. A lot of other colleges that you obviously may be aware of just in North Carolina, from the Dukes and the Chapel Hills and the NC States and a lot of those. And we actually have one of the UNC system schools as well, which is UNC Greensboro. And then you can see just a little bit again about who we are. We have about 35,000 students. I think that's closer to 14,000, which is the FTE equivalent, and 6 campuses in a small business center. I want to kind of move right in terms of the biggest threats for North Carolina, but also specifically for this part of the state. As I mentioned, we're sort of central North Carolina, so we're about maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours from Raleigh, if you've got capital. Half an hour and a half or so to Charlotte. You've probably heard of Charlotte. And then we're about 3.5 to 4 hours from the beach and 3 to 4 hours from the mountain. So we really are truly the central part, and a lot of the highways connect through our area. But the big ones for North Carolina are hurricanes, thunderstorms, tornadoes, and ice storms. Those are the biggies. One of the second line, though, of the droughts and things that you see, that's not any less important, because this area is also prone to a lot of civil disruption and riots, which I'll get to in a minute before I hand it over to Ron. And then the normal things that you and your universities have been dealing with as well. I wanted to share some specific pictures with you from close by, as well as around North Carolina over the last couple of years. This is literally right at 2.1 miles from our Greensboro campus, as you can see here. But this is a Hampton Elementary School. There's a lot of damage here in the Greensboro area. And this is one of those situations where, again, not far from one of our campuses. In fact, this school is still not open. They've actually consolidated with another school, and they're trying to, our local school board is trying to figure out what they're going to do overall with this particular school. This is UNC Wilmington, and if you know about the Wilmington area in general, you're always hearing about hurricanes hitting this area. This is just one of those things with Hurricane Florence a couple of years back. We are part right here in the central part of the state, so a lot of times we don't get the direct impact, but we get a lot of flooding and things that is coming from the coast our way. Moving forward, let me see just literally Craven County, also the college down there. You're talking about 30 members of the college staff and faculty were affected with loss of vehicles and housing. And you literally see pictures from the destruction that has happened down in Craven County area. Moving forward back to Charlotte, because I wanted to hit some of our general cities when I was mentioning things. A few years back, again, I know you were all around the country. We had a really devastating shooting down there where students were killed. And Charlotte, UNC Charlotte kind of reeled from that particular circumstance. And then this is Greensboro. And this is not Greensboro from a long time ago. This is Greensboro from the George Floyd protest and various things that were going on in the city. You're looking at one picture there, which is the iconic Woolworths building, which is now the International Civil Rights Museum. And this is one of the few that you see on the left. It's one of the few buildings that actually burned. But downtown Greensboro was a destruction zone. And here is one of the images that you see from downtown, where you've got the protesters and then you've got the police department, and you see some of the busted out glass along the way. You may ask kind of why are we that way? Greensboro's had a long history. We're proud of this history, to be quite honest with you, in terms of the civil rights movement. We are one of the stops on the U.S. Civil Rights Trail through the federal government. Guilford College, which is actually a Quaker-based school that I attended, is my alma mater. We are part of the Underground Network from back in the 1800s. So the Underground Railroad stop is still something out that way. We also have the largest historically Black college and university here in Greensboro area. We have one of the oldest women's only schools here at colleges with Bennett College. So a lot of history with civil rights, a lot of things going on overall, but I want you to see some of the images and just some of the things we have to do directly with here. You may ask, and I mentioned about A&T, is why A&T is kind of famous and why that Civil Rights Museum that you're seeing there is kind of celebrating, and it's really for state, for local, state, and federal, is the sit-in movement began here. If you're familiar with your civil rights history, there was a silent thing where the students at A&T sat at the lunch counter. Blacks could not be served, and they sat at the counter and basically with drinks and stuff and cigarette burns and stuff thrown in their face, and then ultimately that was the catalyst for that sit-in movement occurring all around the country, which ultimately led to opening up for minorities in terms of eating at some lunch counters. So again, it's the largest, and they received a huge gift not long ago, about $45 million from Jeff Bezos' wife. I can't remember, Mackenzie Scott, I think is her name. So that's basically A&T in general. The good part is I'm finishing up my section before I move on to Ron, is ultimately it really turned, you saw the ugly images, but basically a lot of the things downtown were turning into images of positivity and love, and how can we kind of get through these times together and working together. So I wanted you to not see the bad stuff and not also see the good, because there's a lot of good in this community overall, and we're taking some positive steps forward. But that leads us basically to kind of my takeaways, and then just want to keep moving forward. I want you to know about this area, what it's about, our school in general. We'll talk about some of my brief takeaways, even in my period here with GTCC. My former role, and you can go back and look at my description under Kowali-based app itself. But I've done some work in the past with 911, also with the Public Safety Administration with the City of Greensboro. And I can tell you, when I first started here in a part-time capacity, the support from the college leadership was critical. The previous president here, his name is Dr. Parker, by the way, he actually was saying we must have a business continuity system. I want to know how we will function if we lost some of our campus applications. And so that was my first intrusion into higher education. It was completely new for me. I will be quite upfront with you to tell you that I completely was unaware of all the issues with higher education in terms of the peak periods and the rolling deadlines and the staffing, 10-month versus 12-month versus temporary employees. And that was my big mistake, because coming in early, I was asked, how quickly do you think you can give us a business continuity plan in place? Coming from city government, and now in particular, where we've got backups if something fails, and also from radio systems, we've got backup of backups. I just assumed there were some things in place. And I was woefully wrong in terms of that, because I was like, I can knock the plan out in 6 to 12 months. It has now taken us probably 2+ years to even make our way through round one, because of literally every time you think you can reach somebody, well, that faculty member is now gone. This person's gone. And then we've got some things as I'll transition to Ron that I think he's really been a great addition to the GTCC team. I mentioned business impacts, and I know a lot of you on today, you do this type of work, but for us, we have the business impacts. We also have the community impacts. And I wanted to mention that specifically back to the riots and back to the other things. We don't technically know how many of our GTC students may get involved in some of the things we're seeing around Greensboro when we have these events that occur. We just know that whether it's a community impact or the impact that you saw from the weather situation that knocks out one of the K-12 schools not far from one of our campuses, we just have to be aware of the business side and the community side overall. Early on, I did try to define our core college departments. You've got two of them today, which is why I'm excited that Ron agreed to do this in Christian, because in the Christian side of the house, being in business and finance, there's nothing that makes people more mad than to mess with their schedule and mess with their money. They like to get paid and they don't want their schedule messed with. So that's what Christian can speak directly to you today, hearing directly from someone in that area, what's important to them and how they have managed throughout this process. And then IT in general, when I first arrived here, and I will give total kudos to Ron, one of my first questions I wanted to ask is, I immediately went to IT. I wanted to know exactly what's your disaster recovery plan? How are things backed up? What are our single points of failure? What's important to the end users? What do you consider some of your primary software packages and programs that you utilize? I will be honest, I didn't get a lot of answers. When Ron came on board, Ron has really pushed that forward and have a great relationship with IT now as they're moving through a lot of different challenges. And then for me, as I kind of transitioned to Ron, the other thing right off the bat that was one of our challenges, and for the larger group to understand, Terry and the quality team are aware of this, but we literally were planning to go live at the beginning of 2020. They were here in December of 2019, training the trainers per se. And then starting in January, when we were going to come back from spring break, we were like, oh, so excited, we're going to launch business continuity. Well, just as soon as we launched business continuity, the pandemic hit. So, but it was so helpful to actually have a software system like a Kawali, because previously we were still using, it was all over the place, from spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheets to Word documents to all over the place. And we tried multiple things. So I'm appreciative of having at least a standardized software to be able to enter the information overall. I'm now going to move forward to transition to Ron. You can see some of our local headlines that we've had along the way, where we've got whether it's a cyber attack that hit the campus and varying things. And so one more for me, I like to kind of always have at least one funny in a presentation. And this is our disaster recovery plan goes something like this. And that is literally how it was when I first started here. It's pretty much one of those help, help, help. And but it's no longer that way, and that's due to this man that's getting ready to speak to you next. And this is Ron Horn, our Chief Information Officer from GTCC. And Ron, I'll just kind of start off with a question for you to share whatever you'd like to share about yourself, but also if you could just tell us a little bit about the GTCC cyber attack, what happened, how was it discovered, to kind of kick off.
Sure. Thank you, Wesley. So first, just let me say, echo a lot of what Wesley said. We, the college, the ITS department specifically, when the pandemic hit, preparation was key, and responsiveness was key, obviously, to make sure that we could maintain operations with the college and through the college in a different environment, and in a remote environment in the case of the pandemic. Just as we had actually started to see things settle down somewhat, September the 13th hit us. And that's a day I'll never forget, because it was the day that actually we were hit with a cyber attack. And so that you don't have to look at your calendars, that was on a Sunday. So I actually was out that morning mowing the yard and received a phone call from another staff member that said, hey, I've got this screen popping up on my monitor, and I don't know what it means, what to do, but I don't think it's a good thing. And so the conversation continued, and I said, hey, just tell me a little bit about what you see. And he did. And I said, well, okay, we've got a problem. Don't do anything with your computer. As a matter of fact, just unplug it from the network for me, if you would, real quick. Reach around the back of it and get the network cable and just unplug it for me. And then the phone calls ensued soon thereafter, up the chain of command and security folks and things, to let them know that it looks like we may be having a cyber attack. And subsequently, a conversation with my security manager, just within a matter of minutes, it looked like early that Sunday morning in the AM, the wee hours of the morning, we had several thousand attempts and hits on our network. And at one point, obviously, they did get through. That day kind of was the beginning of a different life for me, if you will, since September. It's now, we're now into the 1st of March. And we found, we called agencies in to help us to try to figure out where the attackers may have came into our network or our infrastructure and how bad the damage was. Initially, the first response was get everything off the network that we possibly could, first and foremost, and try to protect as much as we could and limit, if you will, the amount of damage that could take place, because at that point we didn't know how much damage that we had suffered at that point.
Ron, can you share kind of the extent of the systems that were affected? I mean, from the ERP type of systems and just the level of the system degradation or corruption.
Sure. So the damage was widespread. The attackers had moved through our network. We had some pretty stiff controls in place. You can, if any of you are, or you're working directly with your IT directors, your security managers or directors or whatever, chief security officer, they'll tell you, set up your controls, put the right policies and procedures and the practices in place, and try to protect yourself as best you can. And they always say in the industry, and I've heard this for years, it's not if, but when it's going to happen. I said it myself, and then it happened. And so the extent of our damage was widespread across the campus in the entire college. It affected initially our network, to include our phone system, our wireless network, obviously our wide area network and local wide area network to our other campuses, and local area network within the Jamestown campus. And then from a systems perspective, nearly everything was affected. We didn't have to rebuild everything. But we chose to start from a greenfield, if you will, and that means building everything back up from scratch, because the assumption that we were making was that nothing was safe, and we wanted to make sure that we eliminated the possibility and the risk that there were any remnants of the attack vectors that were still in our network or on any of the machines within the college network, and which was about 4,000 endpoints, not to mention the number of network and interconnected devices and such.
So when you're talking about those type of systems, I mean, literally, and I'm aware of this, but I may not even know the extent of it, but you're talking about security cameras. The police department was affected with either their reporting systems that they're doing. You're talking about HVAC control, so we couldn't control the power on the building to change the heat or everything. So you're talking about just that level of issues that are affected.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anything not just IT related, but anything operationally was affected that connected to the network. Applications that were loaded on servers, because we had not moved to the cloud yet. We were in the process, actually, of moving our ERP, our student information system, to the cloud, but we hadn't implemented that yet and gone live. So nothing essentially had been moved to the cloud. We have some software as a service applications like O365, Office 365, which is hosted in the cloud that we were running. Microsoft Teams, which is hosted in the cloud, we were running. But all of our other applications at that time were not in the cloud. They were either hosted on a workstation or hosted in a virtual server environment.
Okay. And actually, that leads me to just a couple more questions. And then remember, if you have direct questions for either me or Ron, just go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get around to those at the very, very end. Ron, so what were the immediate first steps to recovery? I know you said you had a lot of partners and folks helping along the way, but I mean, just to help the individuals out there, some from the IT environment, some from the business continuity and emergency management. What literally was that first step? So we've got to get this done. We've been kind of building the foundation back since that point.
Sure. So that's a great question. You sometimes when these things happen, you don't know how you're going to react until it actually happens to you. Our first step, obviously, was isolation. We wanted to isolate the extent of the damage as much as we possibly could. And that was our very first step. And their very next step was an assessment, to try to figure out what was damaged, what was usable, and then develop a plan for recovery. And so, and those steps are many and several pages long. As a matter of fact, we're still working through those steps. At one point, and this was a couple of months ago, I was speaking with one of my peers, and I said we had over 200 projects going at the same time, and this was all part of the recovery effort. And so that being said, as in assessing the damage, we had to know what departments were affected, what needed to happen first. And as Wesley mentioned a few moments ago, you talk about people's time and people's money. We had to make sure that we were paying people. And so the payroll system obviously was one of the first things that we had to get up and running again and operational. Then we had to look at the phone systems, and then we had to look at the network and the wireless networks. We actually set up a temporary wireless network just so we could get up and running. I will say that credit to the IT staff, we were down for one day, completely down for one day only. It hit on Sunday, we were down on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the staff had a temporary network, wireless network set up, and we were starting to operate. We immediately started looking to put wireless adapters on computers so people could get up and running. Fortunately, we had a good infrastructure. We moved everything over to the temporary wireless network. Keep in mind that temporary wireless network was not a full network that we would be used to operating on right on a normal day. There were a lot of limitations. We couldn't do all the processing that we did before, but we had to get the least amount of services that we needed, necessary services, up and running at the time. And so part of that first steps to recovery was do a quick assessment, get out to the stakeholders, talk to them, and everybody working together to see what operations and what functions we needed to work first.
Right. I really appreciate that. And I guess just to kind of round it up, you sort of answered a little bit of kind of where things stand today. The final question would be kind of where are things, where do they stand today? And then also if you could kind of mention any kind of lessons learned that you'd like to impart upon our attendees today.
Sure. So where do we stand today? We are nearly recovered. As I said earlier, we started from a greenfield, so we assumed everything was dirty, if you will, and on the dirty network, and we wanted to start clean. So we started re-imaging everything and bringing up, new network, a new wireless network, a new internal LAN and WAN networks. Every workstation we assumed was dirty and was infected. And so we've had to re-image those. And I told you earlier, I referenced the 4,000 endpoints. We haven't had to do all of those, but we've had to do a fair number of those, for faculty and staff, not the students, fortunately, but for faculty and staff. So we're probably a little better than 90% of the way recovered right now. All of our major systems, for the most part, have been recovered. We have a stable network up and running now without issues. And I can't say where we are today without mentioning there's a lot of work that's come into play, both with the IT staff and with the college staff working together to help to restore all of these systems and get back to where we were, let's just say. So we're probably a little bit above 90% today. And with that, you'd also ask what lessons learned, and I kind of want to, I guess, end it with that. This has been, I've spent, I've done IT all of my life, and I spent the last 13 years in healthcare, and that environment is constantly under attack. We are in higher education as well, because the value of the records that these attackers can get access to and sell on the dark web, it's amazing how readily available people's information is. And so in healthcare, we experienced a lot of these attacks, but not to this level, where we would have an attack and we could remediate it within hours. So this was the worst one that I've encountered or been a part of in my entire career. I would tell people, this is probably the best platform to talk about, disaster recovery and business continuity. I would tell everyone to, everybody says it, make sure that you have backups. And as Wesley said earlier, backups of backups of backups, that you always have a plan B, I'll just call it, that if plan A doesn't work for you anymore, the plan B you can get up and running in a minimal amount of time. That you have backups in place, that they're current backups, that they're not 6 months, a year old or whatever, but they're current. So talk about, people talk about images or snapshots of these things. Make sure that they're doing them frequently, and then that you're testing them. That you at least do a quarterly test, and maybe you have tabletop exercises. I came from an environment where we had tabletop exercises all the time. I would say that have tabletop exercises and act like that you're going through something like this. And so the backups, a cybersecurity policy, insurance policy is a must. It will more than pay for itself if you ever experience an event, because there are a lot of things that people don't think about when an event like this happens, when you have to call in augmented staff to help you restore, or you have to restore systems that you might have to bring in additional organizations and partners to help you restore their software because your backups were infected, or just your primary system was encrypted. So, and the cyber insurance policy comes in handy for that. Damage control, reputational damage, dealing with the media these days, and obviously legal fees and litigation and credit reporting and credit repair for people who are involved. And it's huge. The list is just gigantic when you go through one of these attacks. And so I would strongly suggest having a cybersecurity policy in place with an insurance company. And probably lastly, to finish this off, I want to go back and say, go back and review your disaster recovery and business continuity plans and make sure that they're up to date, and that you're testing them. Things change, as Wesley alluded to earlier, people change. This environment, he's right. There's a lot of turnover, people coming in and coming out and going out. And you have to make sure that these plans are updated with policies and procedures because they're constantly changing. I can't overemphasize enough the importance of having up-to-date and current disaster recovery and business continuity plans.
Ron, I really appreciate the feedback, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you at the end about just the experience here. So thank you again. I know you're going to stay around. We had the transition, just who was sharing the screen, I think you all probably saw that. Now we're transitioning to Christian Dotson. And again, I literally was trying to have the attendees today kind of hear the varying perspectives, and Christian is really the right person for you to hear all of the things that are happening in the business and finance office throughout all of this time. So Christian, you take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Wesley. Good afternoon, everybody. I've got my camera on to say hi to everybody. I'm going to turn it off to make sure the presentation goes smoothly. So as Wesley mentioned, our business office obviously was drastically impacted by this cyber attack, but the pandemic also made our problems a million times worse. So what I'm going to take you through today is a little bit of a journey of kind of how we got to where we are now and everything that's happened. So just a little bit of background information from our office. You see our organizational structure here. We do have about 60 full-time employees in what we call our business office. If you look at the bottom row of the chart, you can see all the areas it covers. So what we call the business office is basically anywhere where money comes into the office or also items. So we have shipping and receiving in the mailroom and stuff like that. So it is a pretty big operation. It has a pretty big reach. And we've always had some type of continuity plan. I'm not going to call it a formal plan over the years, but just because we're the backbone of a lot of the operations on the administrative side of the college. We've always had an understanding of how important it was to have one of those plans and also keep those updated. But kind of as I go through this, you'll see how we've still managed to find challenge after challenge over the last year. So Wesley mentioned last winter, we were working with him to get our plans formalized in the Ready software. Here's some of our critical functions we identified. This isn't an exhaustive list. But one of the things you'll notice is that we made a decision that all of our processes, although we feel they're very critical, we decided that they should be a critical too. And the reason why we did that was because we thought in the big picture, critical one should be things like, do we have power? Do we have water? Do we have internet? Are critical systems up? So some of the stuff Ron was talking about. So then we thought our stuff would kind of layer in as the next most critical stuff. So you'll probably see familiar stuff you associate with the business office here: payroll, AP, purchasing, our cashier's office stuff, so receipting and financial aid. And then we also went through the process of, identifying stuff that was less critical and deferrable. So as the pandemic hit, we were finalizing these plans, and we had already identified quite a few things that we needed to fix now. So one of those was, for example, no one in our purchasing office was set up to take a laptop home. Every one of them had desktops. They had one laptop for the whole office, but no one could take it home because it ran the AV equipment for our conference room. So one of the things we had to do right from the beginning was go through their office and all of our other areas. Okay, does everybody have a laptop? Can you work from home? Then once we got that, it was, okay, well, you got a laptop, but now you need VPN access. So we started doing that for purchasing and other critical staff. And then we had the stay-at-home orders issued. So then people that we would never, ever have thought needed to work at home before, we had to get them set up. So for example, all of our cashiers, the whole cashier's office staff. So we still served them remotely for a couple months while we were close to the public, but they were still having to work from home. So we worked through that process. We also spent a lot of time identifying critical equipment, supplies, and stuff like storage spaces that we would need if we were ever, had some major incident. So let's say a building was leveled or, wide scale flooding. So we were looking at things like, okay, if our building was gone and we had to go set up somewhere else, we need a fireproof safe with, so we could put money somewhere. We need some storage areas if we're buying equipment and that's coming in with security cameras. We need to make sure we have backup check stock in case we have to manually write checks, printers and software. So we had gone through this very elaborate list and we felt we had done a really good job. We also started working to move stuff that was stored on local servers, either to the cloud or other software, so that we could get to that if our network was down. So the screenshot you see here is actually GTCC for years had a portal that was one stop for both employees and students. And you'll see the arrow on the bottom left. We put a team site out there. Well, it was very short-sighted to think that that would always be available if our systems were down. So we moved stuff to Koali. As Ron mentioned, we were also using Teams and OneDrive, and we got a lot of that stuff moved. However, we still had thousands and thousands of our operational files on our network folders. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you, we still don't have a good answer for this, but we had all of those files and we were trying to figure out better storage solutions for those. And then just a simple thing, we made sure our emergency contact lists were updated for all of our employees. We had some staff that didn't have reliable internet. We got them hotspots. I think at one point we even couldn't get more hotspots because, everybody needed hotspots at that point. So we got some cell phones. So one of my folks has a cell phone, a GTCC cell phone that she uses as a hotspot. And then we also had employees make sure that they were receiving our E2 campus emergency alert. So that's what the college uses for everything from it snowing to, there's a gas leak, so that we could notify all of our employees if there was an emergency. So all this to say, we thought we had a really good plan. But then the cyber incident happened and we figured out that our nailed it looked a little more like this than what we thought it did. So what happened? So obviously we got everybody laptops, we got everybody VPN access, everybody was set up to work from home. We had, everybody doing great. But then all of our systems but email were down for weeks and some of them were down for months. And as Ron mentioned, we still have stuff down. And then once services started being restored, VPN was still down in December. So this cyber attack happened in September. So all the stuff that was up, folks had to come to campus to do. I don't know if you guys remember the news last fall leading up into the holidays. COVID cases were going crazy. So there was a lot of anxiety from staff. There was trying to do social distancing when you were in the office with more people than you wanted there. And then when we first brought our system back up, in our clean room and our IT department, we had 8 computers. We have over 1,200 employees. So we had 8 computers to try to figure out who got a seat today on our ERP. And if you want to look here on the right, I've got a map. This is from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, just for some reference here. This is our trajectory of cases from last March. And I think I took the screenshot about a month ago. The you are here is when our cyber attack happened. So you can see the cases just going up the whole time. So that was some extra stress on top of the cyber attack that we were dealing with. We also quickly realized that a lot of our planning was related to physical destruction of buildings and equipment, not prolonged lack of access. In North Carolina, Wesley showed you, we're used to tornadoes and hurricanes. That's building structures. It's not, you're not going to be able to get to your software for 4 months. Or we have some manual check stock, but we need to get 2,000 financial aid checks out the door and 1,200 payroll checks. We didn't have that much check stock. And we didn't have printers that worked on our network, so we couldn't print. So we had gone through this elaborate list, but we hadn't thought about the impact of different type of events on these things. And then also, so I mentioned we had started moving a lot of our stuff to cloud-based locations, but we were using those folders, sorry. Those were compromised. So we didn't get those back for a while. They were restored from a backup, which meant that the version we got wasn't the latest version we had saved. And in the meantime, staff had also had to start from scratch and create new stuff for a couple of months. So then once we did get the files back, we had to spend more time reviewing the files to see what we got, merging the originals and then the stuff we had been using. And then we had tons of databases that we have built over time that point to files at a specific place on the network. So all of our databases had to be redirected to those new files. So on top of everything else going on, then we had to stop and spend all this time to try to get our files back in order. So one of the most public facing issues that we had, and Ron kind of alluded to this, communication is really hard. So what you're seeing here was the entire message This is the first message that went out on our social media page on Sunday, September 13th, in the middle of a pandemic. And y'all can probably quickly notice that, yes, we're saying we're closed. We give no reason why. So the next thing that happened, and these are literally comments I've screenshotted, it's all still out there. These were obviously not very nice comments. Students weren't very happy with us. Also on the right, that second comment you see about face-to-face labs for health science programs, that was one of our faculty that posted that. Our faculty didn't even know what was going on. But the biggest issue everyone needs to keep in mind when we have a cyber attack is that what you can share is going to be extremely limited, especially in the beginning, because it's an ongoing criminal investigation and you just don't know yet. So we eventually did later that evening get an update put out there. And this was the first time students were notified that it was actually a cyber incident. So then these comments started. So we had the folks out there going to try to tell everybody that your information's compromised. We had students specifically asking about their account and their information. We had a student that didn't even know what a cyber incident was. So I can tell you personally, I started seeing some of this. It was about 10 o'clock that Sunday night. I'm texting our vice president like, hey, is somebody monitoring our social media accounts? And I think Ron was actually one of the folks they sent out there, but we had employees just trying to answer some of these comments to calm some of the students down from their personal Facebook pages. So obviously that wasn't ideal. And then our offices opened back up. So then you had students on the phone who were very, uneasy about what was happening. They weren't sure, they wanted answers, but staff couldn't give them any detail about what was going on either. For our office, that mostly impacted cashiers because they're student facing and they're dealing with their, their money and their personal information anyway. But once they got past the personal information questions, generally the next question was, what about my financial aid disbursement? Most of our students are on financial aid, and we couldn't give them an answer about that either because our systems weren't back up. So there was a whole lot of difficult conversations. And I would say it was probably a couple of weeks before we could, actually give them information about, okay, the disbursement schedule is not affected. But it was even longer than that before we knew that whether or not people's personal information was impacted. And if there's one takeaway for anybody here today, it's probably this slide. What we learned for all of our critical functions was that we had a huge blind spot. So this is a question directly out of Ready. How would you carry out this critical function if the data network is not available? We said it can't be carried out with network access, and we moved on to the next thing. So we didn't explore any backup options. We just ended our discussions there. So that's obviously what we're working through now. But I would encourage you, if any of you have this answer to any of your critical functions in your plans, you cannot start early enough trying to identify backups. So how do we get by? So my short answer to everything is we were super creative. So payroll was obviously our first biggest issue that Ron alluded to. And the biggest issue we had was that we didn't have direct deposit information for a lot of our employees. So this happened in September. So a lot of our part-time staff didn't work over the summer. They came back to teach fall classes. So this would have been their first payroll. So what we ended up having to do is actually cut a bunch of payroll checks rather than doing direct deposit. Well, that meant in the middle of a pandemic, you had to set up a time to get hundreds of people to come up to campus to pick their checks up. So, again, this probably wouldn't have been a big of a deal if there wasn't a pandemic going on, but that just made it worse for us. We were fortunate that for full-time payroll, we were able to use the file from the previous month. And so because our payroll for full-time staff and faculty and staff doesn't change very often month to month, it's just the people who left and came, we were able to just edit that file for most of the employees and get that payroll to run through. Accounts payable, the biggest issue was lack of access to a check printer. So network printing was down for a couple of months. Thankfully for us, we're very fortunate we have somebody that's tech friendly in our accounting and reporting area. She actually built a database to mirror what our checks look like. And we went and bought some microtoner And we went and hooked one of our big giant printers up just straight to a workstation, and she printed out checks that way. However, we were also fortunate that they were able to get our ERP back up quickly. So that worked for us. If your ERP wasn't back up quickly, that wouldn't have been an option. For cash receipting, we were only able to take payments for transactions with a set fee. So for example, transcripts are $5. We know how much it is. If you come in there, we can take your payment. I think we also finally decided at 1.2, if you had a printed out statement or bill, we'd go ahead and receipt that payment. But if somebody just came in and said, hey, I got a past due balance I want to pay, we couldn't help them because we didn't know what their past due balance was. We also have one standalone credit card terminal on our main campus. It works through a standard phone line. So we had one credit card terminal to take any credit card payments for about 10,000 curriculum students and the thousands of continuing education students that we have. So this was a challenge. We are in the process of ordering additional credit card terminals, at least one for our other campuses. And then, don't have this in here, but one of the other issues we faced was once our system did come back up, cashiers had to stay open, but our clean computers were in a different building on a completely different part of our main campus. So they would be open part of the day and write manual receipts all day long. And then they'd have to take all that work over to our IT department so that they could enter that in our ERP so that we could capture that. So basically we were doing double work for weeks. Financial aid processing. This is probably one of our most fortunate things. This happened on a Sunday. I believe it was that Thursday or Friday. We had finished a financial aid disbursement and had sent the file to the bank and had cut the checks. So the disbursement that was due to go out that week, we were ready for that already. So we did have a few weeks to kind of get our act together for the next disbursement. But just like payroll, students didn't have the option to update any of their direct deposit information in the system. So we didn't want to send out financial aid to accounts that might be closed or wrong or whatever. So we elected to mail those out, paper checks. Obviously, this made thousands more checks to run through our Access database. But I don't know what happens at your school, but our students aren't necessarily the best at keeping their personal information updated. So tons of those checks came back. They were trying to track down students, update addresses, or get students to come pick those checks up. So that just made a bunch of extra work as well. For purchasing, they were less impacted just because the state of North Carolina does use a statewide e-procurement system that's web-based. So we were able to do some functions, but we also heavily use P-cards, and the management of that is on our bank's website. So we were still able to do all that. And then our campus stores, again, fortunately for us, this happened right after our fall rush period. So it was actually one of their slower periods, but they were down for a significant period of time. Ron mentioned too about backups. One of their main systems, we were able to get a backup, but I believe the backup was from November 2019, and this happened in September 2020. So they did lose almost a year's worth of data that had to be, a lot of stuff rebuilt and figuring out how to get that back where it needed to be. All right, so what have we learned since then? One of the things our office, but all of the departments in the college need to do is more exploring of backup options for critical functions. For us, we're starting with researching inexpensive check writing software so we wouldn't have to manage that manual database we built, and whether that's buying some software that we just have, or if there's services that you just pay a small fee to have them kind of on retainer, and it would be more of a fee if you're actually using or writing checks. That would be an option too. The next two things we know we have to explore are backups for payroll and financial aid processing. And I apologize today, I don't have a good answer for either one of those. So we've got to spend some time looking at that. Also, I mentioned, how we labeled all of our stuff a critical 2, and we left some other stuff as critical 1. That's not enough. So doing that in your department is great, but the college as a whole also needs a more comprehensive understanding of what's most critical in different scenarios. So as Ron mentioned, as soon as they got our ERP back up, we started with payroll. That was literally the first thing. So we have that as critical 2, and there may be dozens and dozens of things that are critical 1. But we need to understand depending on the scenario, what is most important in that scenario. Also, so we all know that there's many things that can push you towards your business continuity plans, and they're all going to be different. But we've got to have a well-developed communications plan for all of that, including management of social media accounts and notifications for employees and students. And just keep in mind, again, when it's cyber attack related, you're going to have issues communicating for the simple fact that, it's that ongoing criminal investigation, and there's not a lot you're going to know, day one, day two. And then also, as difficult as it's been since September for all of us, we've learned a ton about our processes. So I've been at college for 18 years. I can tell you, I know more about stuff that I never thought I'd have to know about ever in my life. If we don't document that now, we're going to lose it. So, you've got employee turnover, or you're going to be 5 years down the road, relying on somebody's memory for what happened. So just keep in mind that if anything happened like this, now's the time to be documenting. And then I think Wesley and Ron will both tell you that I try to get through life with a little bit of humor. So I'll leave you with, these are my feelings about 2020. It was pretty much the worst. I think I'm kind of getting to the point where I can laugh at that. The one on the right here about, can we uninstall 2020 and install it again? It has a virus. I don't know if Ron can laugh about that yet or not. But that's where we are. Obviously, we still have a ton of work to do. And we understand that these are plans that need to be updated, constantly anyway. But, we've definitely identified some holes in our plans that we know we've got to start addressing soon. So Terry, it looks like we've got a few minutes. I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
And Terry, just before you start, I wanted to say thank you, Christian, for, again, being willing to be part of this, and Ron again. And I want to share one last 30-second piece. My fault in all of this, and because I like to take responsibility for some different things in terms of ways of looking at it, maybe fault's too strong of a word. Christian specifically hit on the area talking about network access, and basically some of the plans were blank there. I did not push that issue. I was feeling so overwhelmed trying to complete a plan. And this is really a conversation for the fellow business continuity folks out there and being very realistic. I was pushing so hard to finish plans going, okay, well, we need to get this done. We need to get this done. When are we going to be able to at least say I've completed round one? And business continuity plans are always living, breathing documents, but I was feeling frustrated. So I let that question get away to basically, when I get just either no answer or just a half answer, I let it go. I'm having to go back because that is really a critical thing to get people to think through, even though they may say, oh, we just can't operate. Well, no, I'm going to sit there at the table and say, there has to be something you can do if the network is down. So I just wanted to point that part out in terms of something that I could have done better as a business continuity manager to not let people off the line when we were getting to those tough type questions. So take it away, Terry, and hopefully we got a few minutes left.
Yeah. I just have to say I'm on overload right now. That was such great information from all of you. Thank you so much for sharing that. If anybody has questions, please go ahead and post them in the chat. I'd like to ask, what are you doing different specifically about backing up data more regularly? And are you getting one of those backups to backups to backups out in the cloud away from the network? Ron, question for you.
Yeah, Terry, great question. So as Kristen had mentioned, there was a lot of things we found out about ourselves because of this incident, and some of them were not so good. One, she talked about the backup that was a year old should never happen. And so paying attention to your backup strategy is very important. We are in the process of finalizing our disaster recovery site as we speak, and the cloud is part of that strategy and plan. So we're going to have backups of backups. So they're both going to be physical and virtual, and they're going to be current. As part of our disaster recovery plan, we had to identify, and we were already in the process, Wesley had said, in building the business continuity plan. So we had already identified a lot of the critical applications. And so what we're doing is basically going through that list, Terry, and making sure that we have backups of those images and their frequent snapshots, which is most important, I think, in this process. So we're not complete yet, because this has been an immense undertaking, but we're extremely close. Now, we're currently backing up whatever we have in the cloud today is being backed up today.
Perfect. I like that. With some latency.
Yes.
Great. How about questions from the group? Don't worry about the chat. Just jump right in. Unmute yourself and throw your question out for the group from GTCC.
Hey, Ron, I have a quick question for you. This is Don from Sacramento State. What is the frequency of your backups? Are you doing it like a daily, weekly, monthly? You say backups of backups.
The frequency, Don, depends on the system and how often they need live data. In the instance of our ERP, which is our main student information system, that's backed up daily. Actually, I don't recall the exact frequency. It might be every 30 minutes, maybe they would create a snapshot.
Okay.
Of that. So it depends on the criticality of the system for us, will determine the frequency of the backups.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, this is Carol Cox at Georgia Southern University. I'm just curious if anyone has had any experience with, and not Koali, but in cases where you're relying on a web application and your data being there versus on your network, of having any of those third parties experience this and not being able to access your data because they're down, and kind of what kind of agreements and discussions do you have with those folks to be sure that they're prepared for that kind of thing?
Sure. Great question, Carol. We have, there's a number of different vehicles or tools that you could use. We have what's called the HECVAT, which is a higher education vendor assessment tool that's put out. And we go through their security posture with them as to what controls they have in place. If they are hosting our backup, obviously we want to make sure that that they are having compliance. They deal with compliance. They deal with auditing. They have third parties come in and certify that their backups are legitimate. That there's in the event that you look for PII, personally identifiable information, or HIPAA, in our case, FERPA information for students in higher ed, we want to make sure that that data is protected. And so part of our agreement in the contract process is to talk about our data, where it's hosted, who has access to it, and in the event of a catastrophe, whatever that is, will we still be able to get access to that data? So obviously, I think part of that answer would be, Carol, depends on the catastrophe, right? Because if they had a virtual backup and they didn't have a physical, and their network went down, you wouldn't be able to get access to it. One of the things that I look at is looking at when they do their backups, can we get an image of that? Can we get a snapshot of that? And then we can pull that through something like AWS or Azure and either host it there or bring it in internally.
I'll also add to, we were working on these plans last winter, right before the pandemic. So we thought the pandemic questions in there were crazy at the time. Like, this is never going to happen. And then that happens. We're like, okay, we've planned for that. We've planned for our tornadoes and we planned for our hurricanes because we plan for what we know. It's hard to plan for what you don't know because you don't know what you don't know. In theory, it's easy to think about, oh yeah, like cyber attacks are bad. Your systems go down, but there's little feeders out everywhere that are affecting everything you do. So I don't even know, we could have done some better answers, but there's plenty of stuff that we couldn't have had a good answer for until we've gone through it now, which also is why it's so important to document and capture that while it's still kind of fresh. We can get all that information in one place. So
I love that you make that point, documenting it right now. You mentioned people leave, or we forget about how we experience something 3 years from now when it happens again. So for documenting it, that's something that we talk about a lot. Make sure we're documenting it right now when it's fresh in our minds. That's a great point, Kristen. And to your point, Wesley, it's not a fix and done. The continuity plan is not written and it's becomes credenzaware is what we used to call them. You have to keep those things updated with those constant changes, right, Kristen, as a new event happens and we learn something new.
And Terry, for you, you'd be happy to know I finally made my way through all the departments this week.
Oh, wow.
I've finally been able to check off our nursing department and our aviation department. That was my last one. I'm trying to kind of clean this up, and then I can kind of launch into a new phase of business continuity, get more specific about some of these questions, because it is going to be evolving with regular benchmarks and checks, but I need to be able to at least make my way through that first batch. So Kristen was on the front end completing hers because she's a star of GTCC and she always gets A+ on everything. And so here it is. I finally made my way to the back end of GTCC to get those other ones checked off. And so just making you aware that.
So glad to hear that. That's a huge accomplishment, Wesley, huge accomplishment. I'd say based on what you just experienced, focus on those criticalities. Kristen has a really good view of what's really critical now, and you could probably pinpoint the data associated with that that's critical now, which will help Ron a lot in his endeavors. So that'd be a good place to take it.
Again, we thank everybody for attending. So thank you.
Thank you all very much, Kristen, Ron, and Wesley. We sure appreciate this great presentation, the information that you've shared with us. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.